Okay, continuing on from chapter one, today we're going to cover the fundamental of cybersecurity. We're going to talk about the basics of cybersecurity, the common cybersecurity threats and attacks, and anything related to risk management and incident response. These will be items that will be on the examination. So let's talk about just the basics of cybersecurity. The basic of cybersecurity is around what we like to call the CIA triad. That is a concept that will be on the exam. It's related to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. So when we talk about confidentiality of data, the goal there is really to ensure that sensitive information is accessed by those individuals that has really a need to know, that they're authorized to have access to that information. Integrity speaks to the accuracy of that information, the reliability of that information. I remember when I was working at a pharmaceutical company and we had to do a lot of quality control checks around the information. So think of it. If someone was able to change an outcome of a sample set related to an important vaccine to make it look like there were less issues with the sampling in terms of how the testing was done, then that would get cleared a lot easier through the FDA, etc. However, making sure that the integrity of that data is solid is really another core concept around cybersecurity. Availability. Again, ensuring that that data is accessible to those individuals who actually need it for their business output, for whatever is needed. So confidentiality is about, again, really need to know. Do you have the need to know? Are you authorized to have access to that information? Integrity is about the accuracy, the reliability. Can we make sure that that information is secure in a way that that data has not been altered in any form, fashion, or method? The availability. Is that information available when we need it and by those who are authorized to use it? So again, understand the basic concept. There's a lot more to it, but that's what when we mean the CIA triad from that perspective. Going further, we want to talk about authentication, authorization, and non-reputability. I'm not saying that word right, but you kind of can read it through. So when we think about what's authentication mean, it's really verifying the identity of that user. Think of your bank. They want to know that when you're signing in from an app, are you who you say you are? And then from there, they're going to grant you permission to what you need to see. That's authorization. The other part of that is deniability, meaning ensuring that a party cannot deny the authenticity of the signature of that document. That's from that perspective. All right. So again, these are just core concepts you need to understand. And again, if anything I'm saying you want more information on, just email it to me, and I have tons of really good examples of that perspective. But really, from a concept perspective, really understand those three elements. Now, there are threats in the environment. And I mean that kind of broadly. You walk out the street, there's threats. But let's bring it back to cyber. What are those common cyber threats and attacks that normally happens? You want to think through a threat is really a risk? What is that? That threat could be a potential risk. And malware is one of those things. And there's various types. There's viruses, worms, Trojan, ransomware from that perspective. The methods of how they use those types is via email, malicious websites, infected USB ports. The goal at the end of the day is how could we steal data, corrupt files, and basically make the system inoperable. Because if a threat actor is able to do that, then whatever their intent was as to why they did it would be realized. Some of it is ransomware, again, just being malicious in terms of trying to get money to extort from corporations, individuals, etc. Actually, it has been successful and actually put companies out of business from that. But again, just understanding the types, the methods of how it happens, and what is the effect, what is the outcome if those things are successful from that perspective. When you think of phishing attacks, these are more definition related, right? So phishing attacks have been very successful. They continue to be successful because they work. And basically, they're really emails that are sent to you to invoke more of a reaction from you. Now, it kind of ties in a little bit to psychology here. I'm not going to get into that. My dissertation really was on phishing and how they are successful, why they're successful. But really, it's about deceptive information. And there's different, phishing is one. There's also vishing. There's also a whole other slew of things. But again, this is about crawling, crawl, walk, run. Now, along with the definition that you could kind of read through and I kind of explain, one of the biggest impacts to effectiveness is really around educating users on how this works. What is kind of the way a phish attack happens, along with tools, right? So this is that whole concept, people, process, technology. You have some tools that could do some things, but if it gets through, what's the process? Like, what should individuals do if they're not sure that this particular email is correct? You do have a process that you could put in place by reporting it. And then other teams will look into it, do investigations, and let you know whether it's safe or not, or simply quarantine that from that perspective. But from an exam perspective, just be familiar with these definitions, what they mean from that perspective. Continuing in that whole line of definition, but more concepts, you have denial of service, what we call DOS attacks or DDoS attacks. And the goal there is really to just overwhelm a network. They give it like you're riding on a road, and it's just tons and tons of cars just trying to get through one tunnel. And what you'll notice that it'll start out where it's like many locations, and everyone's kind of converging into the one tunnel. But at the end of the day, or not even the end of the day, while you're sitting there, you're trying to go through it, there's a bottleneck. And in fact, it could then slow everything down. And that's really the intent. If you ever think about a news, something that opens up in the news, and it's everybody's running to CNN or some news outlets, and then their server gets overloaded because it just can't take the volume of people hitting their server. Now, again, we get into redundancy and other things that you need to have in place, but that's really something you need, just the concept of what that is. And then, of course, what is that defense? Implementing robust network security measures, again, like firewalls, like intrusion detection systems, right? So We're getting into a little bit more about some of the tool aspects, but again, this is about understanding the definitions more so than anything else from that perspective. Insider, keeping in the theme of what are the common threats from a cyber perspective, I would say the second area of concern is my insider threat. These are individuals that know where the secret keys are within a house. If they're not happy, they could literally bring that house down. What I mean by bring it down, open it up to individuals who might want to come in and steal certain things. You can have all the protections on the outside of your home, bells and whistles. From what I mean by bells and whistles, you will have cameras. You might have, a big guard dog in the front. You might even have a moat that someone has to basically go across a tightrope to get through. I'm exaggerating a bit, but you get the meaning. But they could do all of that. But if someone just simply says, the key will be waiting for you at such and such, which will bypass all the security exterior elements you've created, then all your controls that you put in place is really not for naught in terms of if someone could just literally just tell you how to bypass that. And that's what an insider is. That individual will misuse his or her access, and we consider this person a trusted source to now do damage within your organization. Now, there are some things that you can do to put in place, right? Such as implementing access control, monitoring tools, making sure people adhere to security policies. So that is, again, some things you could put in place to help reduce your insider threat concern. But they're there. And that's another area where you try to watch for. The other thing you sometimes would want to do for your insiders, and I'm getting off a tad a bit, but there's some value to this statement. Rotation of roles, forcing people to take vacation, forcing people to do other things that they're not normally doing in that role. I have found you will discover some things that are not necessarily nefarious, but gaps, because this individual did not always let it be known that we had these gaps. So again, and I'm going really talking on a perspective of an insider threat. Again, go to my website, go to my blog. I have a whole discussion around this. Now let's talk about risk management and incident response. What is risk management? It's really a process to identify, assess, and then prioritize those risks as it relates to your information assets. When you start anything, I don't care what it is, if you see a question about this, that, and the third, the first thing you want to do is you need to assess and identify that risk and the impact to your information assets. And then how do you prioritize that? So if your information asset is your payroll system, you will first review and identify any risk that could impact your payroll system or your banking system, whatever that is. Then you want to understand what is that level of risk, and then you want to prioritize that to reduce that risk to a level that you are acceptable, which is really acceptable levels, we call it, or within your risk appetite. Think of it this way, we all have an appetite to things in general. So I don't have an appetite to drive 110 miles an hour on the highway. That's just a little bit too much for me because I'm not comfortable with the risk. I'm not comfortable with the outcome. So what that could be, you could be looking at a ticket, a fine, and basically killing people because of reckless behavior. So I'm not good with that. That's not within my appetite. The same concept applies when you're thinking about it from identifying risk within your organization. You may not be comfortable, or your leadership, your stakeholders, you may not be comfortable that if you have a breach, you will have a $20 million impact to your bottom line, which will then increase because now you need to pay out money because of that breach due to fines and other things. So then that's the process part. Then you want to talk about remediation. Once you've done all that, what is your action? How are you going to outline that risk plan and then talk about the strategies to reduce that risk? So let's say, for example, you're not comfortable with a password into your payroll system. That's 12345. All right. Well, how do you want to reduce that in terms of change that? Modify, change that risk exposure. You might say, well, I need to put a plan together that's going to make it a 12-character password. And I'm also going to put a plan in place that's going to be what we call multi-factor authentication. So not only am I putting in my password, there has to be a validation that Paul is who he says he is. That might be via some code back to my phone. That might be whatever. Again, I'm naming some terms that a little bit outside of what I wanted to cover, but as concepts that you deal with today. Multi-factor is if you go to your bank, do an app, and they notice that you're not coming in, well, the first time they're going to have you set it up. So they're going to say, okay, what is your code? You're going to create a code. Then they're going to say, okay, what other mechanism can we communicate to you on that we could reach out to verify that you are who you are? You might say, use my email. You might say, use my phone number. And then they'll validate that by sending you a message to those mechanisms. You will then say, yep, this is me. You will put that code into the application that the bank has. And then they now have verified who you are. So it's multiple facets of authentication to verify that Paul is who he is. Again, the end result of that is you're going to reduce the likelihood and your impact to those security incidents that will happen. So that's really risk management. There's, again, a lot more to it, but those are the foundational concepts. Now, let's talk about incident response. Incident response is a very important aspect of cyber. In general, incident response is just very important in general. Think of incident response as you've had an incident, something's happened, and does everyone know their roles and responsibility? Do we know who to contact? What is the response procedure? Did you test it? Is it regularly tested? So incident response is about really you had a cyber incident, but you could have any incident. Do you know who to call? It's almost like when people have someone come over and watch your kids. You will leave them information, hopefully you do, of who to contact, how to get a hold of you. If you can't get a hold of you, who are the backups? And if all that fails, here's some things you need to do in the interim. Pretty much very similar when you think about incident response as it relates to cyber. Now, no plan is 100% foolproof. It never is. But lack of testing your hypothesis of your plan will not normally give you, or normally wouldn't give you, comfort level, because you don't know what you don't know until you test that plan. And I can tell you, I've written these plans, I've tested these plans and ran tabletop exercise, and I'm always surprised of the outcome because, again, not everybody knows what you think they know. And not everyone knows what their roles or responsibilities are. However, it's through creating your incident plan incident response plan and testing it, do you figure these things out? That kind of concludes chapter 2. I'm going to go into some of the questions that are you would normally see on an exam. It'll probably, again, what are the 3 key concepts of cybersecurity? List 3 common cyber threats. What is the importance of risk management in cybersecurity? What are some best practices for incident response? If you go back and listen to what I said, I've kind of given you those perspectives and those answers. But again, I kind of lay it out. I did talk about the CIA triad, right? So confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. Really understand those points. Common threats: malware, phishing, ransomware. What is the importance of risk management? Really, I talked about identifying those assets and prioritizing what you find, basically the risk, and then against your information assets. What are those crown jewels? Now, once you've done that, you want to basically develop a risk plan. Just figure it out. Just put together how you're going to remediate that risk. In a sense, it is kind of figuring out, now that I think about it, because that's what you're really doing. You're really trying to understand how are we going to reduce this. You got to look at how much money it's going to cost. Do I need more resources? Or do I just transfer this, right? Do I just not do it? So there's different things to risk management and the importance of it as it relates to cyber. Again, effective risk management is really going to assure that you're really prepared to handle those potential threats and vulnerabilities that will arise, and it will. So if you think about that, I talked about vulnerabilities, threat management, and let's say all of that happens, what are some of the best practices for incident response? As I lay out here, you want to define your roles, establish communication protocol, you want to document those incident response, and you got to regularly test. Did I say test? Yeah, test. In my years of doing this, 100%, you will find that not everybody understands and need to do what they need to do. Because what normally happens is panic. Everybody gets into a war room, and now you start being very reactive versus proactive. I have seen it done in both ways. I will tell you, a well documented plan that you have tested makes it feel less stressful than if you haven't done it and now it's a fire drill and people are just really just running all over the place and there's no organization, and you try to bring it in but it just doesn't get where you need it to be. The glossary of terms, I'm going to just again recommend you kind of go through. These are just terms that you have to be familiar with around cybersecurity, malware. Again, I'm not going to read through them because I believe this is kind of a shared responsibility where you are presenting with information, but it's up to you to really understand those concepts from that perspective. So understand what cybersecurity is, understand what malware is, phishing, ransomware, risk management. That concludes chapter 2. Again, as always, please feel free to reach out. If you have any other questions, Dr. Paul Morrison at pkmcyberconsultants.com. We'll move on to chapter 3.